little girl cried out, "Don't hurt us." What the lonely millionaire discovered next shattered him. ChatGPT said, in the grand halls of his mansion, the millionaire lived surrounded by silence so heavy that even the ticking of the clock sounded like an echo in an empty cave. Though his walls were covered with priceless art and his driveway displayed the latest luxury cars, none of it filled the emptiness in his heart. Every night he dined alone at a long table where once there had been laughter, where once the sound of voices had filled the air. Now, the only companion he had was the faint clinking of silverware against porcelain. His empire, built with determination and ruthless precision, had made him wealthy beyond imagination. But the same empire had stolen his joy and left him with regret. Admired by the world, yet invisible to himself, he carried the weight of loneliness, like a cloak that could not be lifted. That evening, as rain began to pour in heavy sheets across the city, he found himself restless and unable to stay within those cold marble walls. He slipped into his car, the leather seats and humming engine giving him comfort only for a moment, and drove aimlessly through the blur of wet streets. The world outside was harsh, painted in streaks of neon lights distorted by raindrops on glass. He passed restaurants filled with people, small homes glowing with warmth, and children running under umbrellas with their parents. Each scene felt like a story he was no longer part of, a reminder of what money could never purchase. Then, as he slowed near a dimly lit street, his eyes caught sight of a small figure pressed tightly against a wall under a broken streetlight. At first, he thought it might be a trick of the storm, just shadows merging with the rain. But as his headlights illuminated the corner, the truth struck him with force. It was a child, her body trembling from the cold, her face half hidden behind, her tiny hands as though she wished to vanish into the darkness. Something about that fragile figure tugged at him in a way nothing had in years. Against his usual instincts of looking away, of ignoring what did not fit into his world, he pressed the brakes and let the car slow to a stop. The rain drummed harder against the roof, and for a moment he simply sat there, staring, feeling his chest tighten with an emotion he barely recognized. Finally, he pushed open the car door, the icy water soaking his shoes as he stepped out. He approached slowly, cautious not to frighten her further. But before he could speak, a voice cut through the storm. It was soft, trembling, yet carried, a weight so heavy it shattered his composure. The little girl cried out with all the fear in her small body, "Don't hurt us." The words froze him in place as though lightning had struck at his feet. "Us?" he thought in confusion. His eyes darted quickly around, and then he saw her, another figure hunched beside the child, a woman, soaked through from the rain, shielding the girl with her arms as though the entire world was an enemy. In that moment, he realized they were not shadows, not strangers passing through the storm, but two lives clinging to each other, terrified and abandoned. For a man who thought he had seen everything, what he had discovered next shattered him to his core. Beside the little girl sat a woman, her body trembling beneath the weight of the storm, her clothes drenched and clinging to her fragile frame. She wrapped her arms around the child as if her embrace alone could shield her from the cruelty of the world. The sight rooted the millionaire to the ground. He had seen desperation in the eyes of competitors. He had witnessed men claw their way through business deals worth millions, and he had crushed rivals with a single signature. But none of that compared to what he saw before him now. This was not ambition or rivalry. This was survival. The child's words, "Don't hurt us," still echoed in his ears, slicing through his heart. What kind of life had forced a child so young to expect harm before kindness? What kind of world had taught her that every stranger might be an enemy? His chest tightened, a pain he had not felt in years spreading slowly within him. He glanced at the woman, noticing the sharpness in her eyes, not from malice but from years of being cornered, betrayed and disappointed. They were eyes that had learned not to trust, eyes that expected every hand extended toward them to eventually turn cruel. The rain poured harder, soaking them further, and still she held her ground, pressing the child closer against her chest, as though she would rather be washed away by the storm than let her guard down. The millionaire, who had built skyscrapers that touched the clouds, who had purchased entire islands for his leisure, who had filled his world with luxuries most could not even dream of, suddenly felt small. His accomplishments seemed hollow, against the simple act of a mother fighting to keep her child warm in the rain. Slowly, with a hesitance foreign to him, he removed the heavy coat draped over his shoulders. It was made of fine fabric, tailored to perfection, worth more than the woman and child had likely seen in years. Yet in that moment, it was not about wealth, but warmth. He extended it toward them carefully, his movements soft, his voice gentler than he had ever used in the ruthless world of business. He found himself speaking not as a powerful man, but as someone desperate to bridge the gulf between them. Still, the woman hesitated, her body tense, her eyes locked on him with suspicion. She did not reach for the coat. She had been let down too many times, and her hesitation was a shield stronger than any armor. But then the little girl lifted her gaze. Her eyes, wide and searching, met his. In them he saw innocence clouded by fear, but also a flicker of hope, fragile yet alive. She studied his face with a seriousness far beyond her years, as if weighing the truth of his intentions in that moment. The storm raged, but time seemed to still as her tiny hand reached out, brushing against the edge of the coat. That single motion struck him deeper than any victory he had ever achieved. For the first time in years, he wanted to be trusted. Not as a man of wealth, not as an untouchable figure of power, but simply as another human being offering shelter against the storm. Against the storm, he finally convinced them to step inside his car. The door closed with a heavy thud, shutting out the roar of the rain, but their trembling bodies told a story the storm could not drown out. The heater hummed softly, blowing warmth into the cabin, and slowly their shivers eased, though their eyes still held a guarded look, as if kindness was a trick they had learned not to trust. He glanced down and noticed their shoes, worn, soaked, and frayed at the edges, shoes that had walked too many miles without rest. Their clothes clung to them like paper, damp and thin, unable to fight against the chill of the night. They didn't belong to the streets. Not in a city filled with wealth, not in a world where abundance existed. Yet the world had abandoned them there without mercy. The millionaire gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, guilt pressing into his chest. He had spent millions on things that meant nothing while people like them were left to fight storms alone. The car moved forward, cutting through the rain-slick streets in silence. From the back seat came the soft, muffled sobs of the little girl, each one like a blade slicing through his composure. She tried to hide her tears, burying her face into her mother's side, but every quiet cry echoed inside the car, making him feel the weight of her pain more than words ever could. The woman, still tense, whispered to her child in a voice too soft for him to catch, but he could hear the rhythm of comfort, the tone of a mother who had carried too many burdens yet refused to break. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, though every instinct in him wanted to turn, to say something, to ease their fears. But what words could erase years of suffering? What could he, with all his wealth, say to convince them that, for once, this moment of shelter was real? When they reached his mansion, the massive gates opened silently, and the car rolled up the long driveway lined with lights. The house loomed like a palace, its chandeliers glowing through tall windows. He had always admired its beauty, its grandeur, its perfection. But as the woman and child stepped inside, he saw it through their eyes for the first time. The little girl looked around, her wide eyes tracing the marble floors and sparkling lights, yet instead of awe, there was fear. She gripped her mother's arm tighter, her small voice breaking the silence once more with the words that had already pierced him that night. "Don't hurt us." Those words shattered him all over again. No matter how beautiful the home, no. Matter how soft the carpets or how warm the fire, none of it mattered because to them it was just another place where pain might live. He realized then that no luxury could erase the scars carved into their hearts. He watched as they sat at his long dining table, where only silence had once kept him company. He ordered warm food, simple but filling, and as they ate slowly, almost cautiously, he stayed across the table, his appetite gone. He couldn't stop staring at the way the child held the spoon with both hands, as if afraid it might vanish, or the way the woman stole glances at him, still unsure whether to believe his kindness. And in that quiet, he saw himself reflected. Back, his emptiness mirrored in their hunger, his loneliness reflected in their fear. For the first time he understood how hollow his wealth had been, and how desperately he longed for something real. That night, the millionaire lay awake in the vast emptiness of his bed, staring at the ceiling as the words of the little girl refused to leave his mind. "Don't hurt us." They echoed over and over, louder than the storm had been, louder than the silence that had haunted his home for years. He thought about what kind of world had forced a child so young to speak with such fear, what kind of cruel roads they must have walked to end up sitting in the rain with nothing but each other to hold on to. For the first time in years, the walls of his mansion no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like a reminder of everything he had been blind to. He realized his wealth had built him a fortress, but that fortress had also isolated him from the truth that lived just outside its gates. He had been surrounded by riches, yet ignorant of the pain that existed in the shadows of his city. Now, as he replayed the trembling voice of that little girl in his head, his mansion felt different. It was no longer a prison of loneliness. It was suddenly a place that could protect, a shelter that could give more than comfort to just one man. When the first rays of morning light touched the marble floors, he rose quietly, his heart heavier than any business decision he had ever made. Yet, beneath the heaviness there was also something unfamiliar, a sense of purpose. Walking through his halls, he expected to be met with the same stillness that had defined his mornings for years, but instead he was stopped in his tracks by a sound he had forgotten. Laughter. It was light, pure, unrestrained, the kind of laughter that had been missing from his life for so long. He followed the sound to the grand room where the child was running freely, her small feet tapping against the polished floor as she twirled and giggled, unafraid at last. The woman sat nearby, watching her daughter with a smile so gentle it seemed to soften the very air around her. For the first time since he had brought them inside, the weight on her shoulders looked lighter, the lines of worry on her face less sharp. The sight struck him harder than any achievement he had ever earned. He had built towers of steel and glass, had collected treasures from around the world, yet nothing compared to seeing his once silent home filled with warmth. This laughter, this presence, this fragile peace, this was wealth beyond measure. He stood there silently, overwhelmed, realizing that money had never been his true fortune. The power he had sought all his life had been shallow, but the power to give, to protect, to heal, this was something priceless. The loneliness that had consumed him for years began to fade, replaced by something deeper than happiness, something stronger than pride. It was belonging. He understood now that the greatest riches are not counted in numbers or possessions, but in the lives we choose to touch, in the hearts we choose to shelter. And in that moment, he was no longer just a lonely man in a mansion. He was someone who finally discovered what it meant to live.